So welcome and good morning. My name is Krause and I work for the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative. We're a long-standing partnership between the UNODC and the World Bank. STAR's work centers on the proceeds of corruption. So we work with both financial centers and with developing countries to assist the process of recovering and returning assets that were stolen through corruption. The basis of our work is Chapter 5 of the UN Convention Against Corruption. Now, first, I would like to thank Transparency International, TI USA, and the US government for bringing us all here together. And to bring you the session fresh this morning and to do our best to set the tone for this week's discussions, the STAR Initiative partnered with our friends at the University of Texas at Austin, Finance Uncovered, and TI Canada. And we're thrilled to be participating here in the world's largest anti-corruption forum here in DC. We hope to use this platform to promote a wide debate about how to stop the abuse of untraceable shell companies in financial crime, improve regulation of enablers, and safeguard the financial system and professions against becoming safe havens for corrupt funds. Now, in light of the European Court of Justice's ruling on public access to BO information in registries, there really couldn't be a better time to discuss the balance between the right to privacy and the right to information about the people who own and control companies than right here, right now. Despite a lot of improvements in beneficial ownership rules in the past years, anonymous shell companies remain one of the most common means of facilitating corruption, financial crime, and global flows of dirty money. Such companies are usually created by professional corporate service providers who sometimes very openly advertise a slew of secrecy services to international clients that are shopping for anonymous corporate structures. Nominee directors, nominee shareholders, and things like mail forwarding services are often a key part of the secrecy toolkit that is offered for sale. But within the broader beneficial ownership transparency agenda, such abuses of nominee services and other secrecy mechanisms and the gaps in the regulation of corporate service providers have received relatively little attention. So you may wonder, what is a nominee and why did we choose to focus on such a seemingly obscure topic here? Well, a nominee is quite simply an individual who holds a position in a company, say a company director or a company shareholder, and who exercises the functions on behalf of or on the instructions of another individual. Of course, what complicates matters is that the terminology differs from country to country, and many countries don't have legal provisions for nominees, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist. But instead of theoretical concepts, today we want to show you in practice some real-life examples of how nominee services are marketed to clients who are shopping for shell companies. The marketing materials openly sell nominee services and other secrecy services as a signature for sale, and I think you've seen our report at the door. These are a stark reminder that beneficial ownership transparency rules do not enforce themselves, and this point applies especially to beneficial ownership registries. Now, it's important to talk about the real-world consequences to corporate secrecy. They are not just limited to corruption. A new FATF definition of nominee directors, which was just adopted in March this year, is very unlikely to rally anti-corruption campaigners that have pushed the beneficial ownership transparency agenda forward so successfully until now. But, for example, did you know that the source of the ammonium nitrate that led to the devastating explosion in Beirut's port in 2020 was hidden by a go-between shell company that was registered in the UK and had a nominee from Cyprus who was listed as a company director and the beneficial owner? Now, despite the information on the UK's beneficial ownership register, this nominee was not the real owner of that company that procured the explosives and had absolutely no involvement or no knowledge about this company. Now, it's important to mention that there are many legitimate and entirely innocuous uses of nominee services. They are often used in very specific corporate environments. These types of nominees usually have specialized skills, and often they have a close familiarity with the principals so that they represent the interest of the principals in the company. But our research, which you will hear from today, shows that these legitimate uses notwithstanding, nominee arrangements are one of the most common devices for hiding the identity of those controlling shell companies, and they are especially prevalent among the most problematic parts of the secrecy industry. Now, despite advances in corporate transparency mechanisms and the establishment of many new beneficial ownership registries in countries, criminals continue to be successful in exploiting gaps in national regulatory frameworks by setting up multi-jurisdictional corporate structures with nominees, and often just through a handful of corporate service providers. So for this reason, nominee arrangements and other practices employed by the corporate secrecy industries, they are not just peripheral to the beneficial ownership transparency agenda. They're not a niche technical issue, but they are critical to this agenda. They are a major and they're an underappreciated point of vulnerability that requires greater attention and more focused policy action. Now, the plan for this session is that our first speaker, Dan Nielson, will showcase STAR's report, Signature for Sale. Dan and his co-author, Jason Sharman, employ an approach of rule testing by rule breaking or mystery shopping, and you will hear more from him later, to test the compliance with international beneficial ownership rules and practice. We asked Dan to sift through all the replies and analyze responses with marketing offers for nominee services. And this analysis provides, to date, the most systematic and direct picture of how package deals with shell companies and nominees are marketed and sold to clients. Then next, if you made it to this room this morning and selected this session, you have probably heard of Scottish limited partnerships. These featured very heavily in some of the largest international money laundering schemes, also known as the laundromat schemes. You may also know that the loophole of Scottish limited partnerships was closed following the discovery of these schemes. But have you ever come across English limited partnerships before? If you haven't, then I think you will enjoy Simon Bauer's presentation about his investigation into 5 particularly suspect company service providers. And next up, we're taking a closer look at Canada, which is a country with a strong rule of law and a healthy, stable, democratic, and economic system. But Canada has also become a sought-after place to incorporate shell companies. James Cohen, TI's executive director, TI Canada's executive director, will tell us more about the corporate secrecy industry in Canada and what the authorities intend to do about it. And then after our 3 speakers, we will try to make the link to policy action, and we will ask for your views on what can be done about what you've just heard from our speakers. We will show you 5 recommendations that this panel has prepared, and we will hopefully benefit from your expertise to help improve and refine these recommendations. So with that, I think I'll hand it over to Dan.
Thank you, Sol. This is joint work with my collaborator, longtime collaborator, Jason Sharman, under the direction of Sol and Emil at the World Bank and the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative. I'm going to give you the high points of the report, which there are copies of in the back. As you can see, if you are already familiar with the report, it's quite detailed. So 10 minutes will not do it justice. So take a look at it, and we would really like to have the conversation continue. So this is where I'm going. I'm going to give you talk about the problem of nominee directors and shareholders. I'm going to give you examples that we actually got in our correspondence. We sent 20,000 inquiries, roughly, to corporate service providers. These are law firms and incorporation services, standalone incorporation services, and nearly every jurisdiction in the world. And we got many replies. And I will show you some of the examples from those replies. And then I'll give you a more systematic overview of the data that we were able to collate and systematically analyze. This is one actual reply we received. And you can see from this and the other examples that I'll give you that the incorporation services and corporate law firms are very specific about what a nominee can provide. right? And they are very clear that that secrecy and privacy is a primary attribute of these nominee arrangements. Now, as Sol mentioned, there are a wide variety of nominee arrangements. Many of them are legitimate and helpful, where nominees take on specific, independent, and helpful roles in company management, especially with complicated corporate structures. We're not going to talk about those kind. We're going to talk about the kind that are purely signatures for sale, as the title of the report suggests. So they don't know anything about the company. In fact, that's the point. So here's another response that we got from a corporate service provider in 2020. And again, this is just to highlight the ways in which CSPs are offering something that is very useful to someone who might want to hide their identity. From public scrutiny, in the case of beneficial ownership registries, or from law enforcement, in the case where that's harder to hide from law enforcement. This is a website. I encourage you to visit. It's still up. I visited last night to check. And this is a rather shady organization based in Panama called Offshore Wealth Web. I have highlighted some of the more interesting passages. The entire thing is very much worth reading, but I pulled out some of the key quotes. You can see, doesn't matter who the front man is, as long as it's not you, right? So they will never know who you are. Okay, so this, I thought, was among the most egregious responses we received. At the end of our study, which we replicated quite recently, and I'm happy to talk about that more in the Q&A, we impersonated people, names that are on the Magnitsky sanctions lists in countries that have Magnitsky sanctions. This is inspired by Sergei Magnitsky, the whistleblower who was tortured and killed by the Russian government because he blew the cover off an extreme tax scandal, a multi-million-dollar tax scandal. So he inspired this legislation. We didn't use the exact names for various legal reasons, but we used the names and replaced the middle initial with a different middle initial than the actual. But this should have raised very serious red flags among our correspondents, and this is the response we got. A shelf company, a company that has been on the books for years, has been aged and therefore has more credibility, could be arranged where the Russian individual explicitly on a sanctions list could be entirely hidden from public view and from law enforcement. So let me tell you about the data. Again, there's no worldwide list of corporate service providers. We had to create this from searches, which we did systematically using keywords in every jurisdiction in the world. We found corporate law firms, business law firms, and standalone and corporation services in those jurisdictions, and we emailed them at least 3 times with different email addresses and names. Some of these inquiries came from actual people using their real names, representing actual companies that we incorporated in 12 jurisdictions around the world. Some of them, when we wanted to press the angles of secrecy, we used aliases, like in the cases of the Magnitsky names. Of those 20,000, we got about 6,000 replies. About 46% of those were refusals, just saying we're not going to do business with you. The remainder, 3,400 roughly, said that they would do business with us, and then they either responded in a way that we could code systematically as compliant with international law, therefore requiring the photo ID of the beneficial owner. We did not require that it be notarized, though I think that is the international standard. And the remainder, the remainder of the replies were non-compliant. Therefore, they did not ask for the ID of the beneficial owner. Among all of those, 473, without being prompted in any way, offered nominee services. Another large share mentioned power of attorney. Those are often combined, but not always explicitly. And so 14% of the replies, the active replies we got, offering to do business with us, offered nominee arrangements without being asked. So you can see here the data, right? Breaking it down. The key thing to note here. See if I've got a laser. Nope. The key thing to note here is that these arrangements are pretty frequently noted, and if we would have followed up with many of the services asking if they could provide nominees, that would have likely been the case, but we didn't even ask. So this was an experiment in addition to an audit study. In a randomized experiment, we randomly assign the approaches to learn if any of them cause different reactions or responses from our correspondents. In this case, we, in one of our randomized conditions, one of our treatment conditions we call them, we said the beneficial owner is very concerned about privacy, so he will not disclose his identity. I was the beneficial owner of all these companies, and so that's what I told my agents to say. So very much an explicit demand for secrecy. We thought that would have a huge effect on the responses we got. We were surprised that we got no significant effect from that. And that was true in a statistically significant way for nominee offers. So you see that when we demanded secrecy, the offers of nominees go up, but those lines with the caps on them, those are confidence intervals, and if they overlap too much, it's not significant statistically. So we did get to see an increase in those offers, but they were not significant. That was true for other risks. So some of our companies were incorporated in countries associated with corruption by our colleagues at Transparency International, or associated with terrorism, according to global indices that are referenced. We didn't find that, in general, these higher risk clients, potential clients, increased the offers for nominees or power of attorney. Not to traumatize you from your past experiences with statistics, but what we're looking for here is something that exceeds the 95% confidence interval. So the p-values, the likelihood that these data were created by chance alone, needs to be below 5%. And you can see that that's the case only with one, that the risk of terrorism seems to decrease the likelihood that our corporate service providers would offer power of attorney without being asked. Now, as some of you who have sophistication and statistics might know, when you do a lot of tests, if you do 20 tests, 1 in 20 will be significant by chance alone. Here's 12 tests, so I don't know how much to put on that one result. I think mostly what we're seeing is not much sensitivity to risk. This was our general finding. We did see reductions in the probability of response, but really not much by way of effects anywhere else. And those sensitivity to risk for response were pretty small in its substantive terms. How about registries? Beneficial ownership registries. We found that countries with registries were more likely to have CSPs that would offer nominee services or power of attorney without being asked. That's a statistical correlation, however. It's not causal, like we would produce with the experiment with treatment effects. So it may be the case that CSPs are offering nominees and power of attorney because of beneficial ownership registry, or it may be the case that because governments see so much on offer for nominees and power of attorney, they created beneficial ownership registries. That's a reverse causality. Or it may be that countries that have sophisticated financial systems are more likely to have beneficial ownership registries at the same time that they offer nominees and power of attorney. So we just don't know. It's not causal. To give you the league table, here's the top 20 that are the most likely to offer the highest proportion of offers for nominees and power of attorney. This is ordered by nominee services offers. Singapore and Australia at the top. Many of you might know, there are good reasons for some of this, but we found it interesting. Here's how it's distributed globally on the map. I can come back to this in Q&A. So, and it's in the report, right? All countries that we had enough correspondence in. The gray is where we didn't have enough correspondence to get any kind of meaningful proportion. The dark blue is where nominees were most commonly offered. It's hard to see the small countries, the island countries. Here they are in the Caribbean Basin. Panama and St. Lucia made the top 20. Others also were fairly frequent, 20% or so of the responses we got offered nominees. So, in conclusion, we need to make nominees a core part of the beneficial ownership discussion. We worked hard with this report to make that so, but this conversation needs to continue. What we see officially in law, statutory, in countries, may not reflect the reality on the ground. And as far as we can tell, only audits like this can generate reliable systematic data to know whether or not the rules on the books are followed in reality. Even if countries are individually compliant with international standards, that's me telling me my time is up, compliant with international standards, when it's multi-jurisdictional, it may still be untraceable, even if every country is fully compliant with offers to one country or from one country for nominees in another country, for a beneficial owner in a third country with a bank account in a fourth country. That doesn't even include corporate shareholders or corporate directors, right, which complicates things much more. So what we have now is probably not getting the job done.
Dan, thank you so much for kickstarting the discussion this morning with both data and then also very clear messages about why having this conversation here this week is so important. Next up, we have Simon Bowers, who is a journalist who specializes in follow the money investigations. He spent almost 20 years at The Guardian, and before that was a coordinator for the ICIJ, and now works as the investigations editor for Finance Uncovered, which is an outfit that supports and collaborates with media in the Global South and in other countries. Simon has worked on some of the largest international collaborative journalism projects over the last decade, so that includes Panama Papers, LuxLeaks, Pandora Papers, and the FinCEN files. Over to you, Simon.
Yeah. So, thanks for that introduction. I'm going to, this is another sort of in the wild look at the raw scenarios of the use of nominees. So this is a project we ran this summer about a particular maneuver in corporate secrecy to circumvent transparency laws in the UK. We ran it with the BBC. Yeah. So just a bit of context. You know, why are UK shell companies? When you think of shell companies, often people think of desert islands or some remote, tiny micronation jurisdictions. The UK is an absolutely huge jurisdiction for shell companies, and this is one of two big takeaways I'm trying to suggest for a look at shell companies. One is that the people who set these things up, they have tireless, endless ingenuity. They will always find a new way of escaping the AML architecture, and one of the ways they've done that is when the AML world woke up to the fact that a lot of dark money was flowing through the BVI or something. They said, okay, we need to do risk-based. We need to force banks to do risk-based assessments, and so all the banks were scrutinizing all the money that came through the BVI. So the formation providers, they just put a wrapper around the BVI company, so the BVI company is at the top, and then they insert a UK company below that opens the bank account, and now the banks don't look at those flows at all. And this is, you can really see this happening at Danske. This is from Danske Bank, the big story, 200 billion US dollars worth of dirty money flowed through that tiny Estonian branch over a number of years, and it was eventually shut down in 2015. But the chart there comes from the bank's own internal or their council report that they produced, and you can see the chart that on that chart, the grey line is the number of corporate clients who were incorporated in the UK. It's more than any other entity. That's what one. But if you think that's an anomaly, UK shell companies, think about the Azerbaijani laundromat. Absolutely swimming with UK shell companies. The Moldovan bank fraud, the Russian mirror trades. Paul Manafort, where did he get, when he was paid money by the Ukrainians for lobbying, where did he get his money from? It was a UK shell company. And the Rottenbergs, when they were sanctioned, but they were dealing art in New York, how did they pay their art dealer? Through a UK shell company. We'll come to more examples, but I'm trying to show you that it's an outsized problem, UK shell companies. But also the typologies, they are replicated in other jurisdictions. So this is the FinCEN files. The FinCEN files was a leak of over 2,000 suspicious activity reports filed by US banks to the Treasury Department. Now, we analyzed that we found over 3,200 UK shell companies in there, far more than you can search for BVI companies or any of the jurisdictions which you associate secrecy with. There were way more UK shell companies, we were able to do some analysis and look at look for the telltale signs for the formation agents that were forming them, and we figured out that there were about nine or 10 that did basically 2/3 of the companies. So a relatively small number of service providers are creating this blizzard of UK shell companies. This is this sort of equivalent piece of analysis for Danske Bank Estonia branch clients. And you can see that one corporate service provider formation agent has created more than half of the UK entities banking at Danske Bank. That's Danske Bank's Estonia branch, where all the hot money was moving. I think one of the problems people think shell companies, it's so easy to set up a shell company. Actually, it's quite a sophisticated layering process, and that there are a key number of players who are producing. They're the biggest sort of factory makers out there, so that they're firing them out. And if it's possible to disrupt what they're doing, that would have a massive impact on money laundering. So I'm going to do this as quickly as I can. It's a bit painful. Look through some UK manoeuvrings. It's a particular manoeuvre that these formation agents were using. So they're all these shell companies are set up as partnerships. Partnerships are attractive because they don't have directors, and they don't have natural, and they can be set up without natural person shareholders. So you've got nominee company 2 are the owners, and it's registered. It's registered to an address that's a mail forwarding address. It's just mailbox, etc., or something, and then you get some corporate stooge to sign the paperwork, and that's it. All those three elements have been supplied by the formation agent, and that completely seals the entity in a sort of secrecy wrapper. There's obviously jurisdictional layering, but that UK partnership can now open a bank account in US dollars. That's the nirvana. They need to get into the US dollar banking system. So eventually the UK government realized there was a problem. So they said, okay, we're going to introduce a law, a beneficial ownership registry, a public one. And so they introduced this registry. And so you can see that the sort of green shield of secrecy is smashed through, and there's this sort of piercing where now I've gone forward one. The owner is now exposed. In corporate paperwork, you can look up whatever the secrecy around that company. You can go and you can look it up online. Who is the ultimate beneficial owner? But there was a problem. They didn't include certain classes of partnership, and this is the inventiveness of the corporate secrecy industry. They quickly latched onto that, and they went into Scottish limited partnerships, and there was a huge surge in Scottish limited partnerships. So the government revised the laws and extended the transparency rules to Scotland, and then of course they shifted on to English limited partnerships. English limited partnerships, I mean, this is getting really wonkish, but they don't have legal personality, so they're virtually useless in sort of real commercial activity, but they're attractive because they sat outside this transparency disclosure regime, so they became incredibly attractive, and there they are. So, and this is one example of a user of an English limited partnership. That's it's not Putin himself, but his buddy there. It's one of the Rottenberg brothers. These were sanctioned individuals, and sanctioned in 2014, and in 2017 they're using this English limited partnership to, according to a US Senate report, I should say, to pay their art advisor, who's a US citizen, on big art deals in New York. So this is, so that's what's going on, and just so you've got a cat and mouse game between there's a transparency agenda at the policy level, and then you've got the secrecy industry that's constantly looking for workarounds. And this is a memo we found in the fantastic massive leak of data, the Pandora Papers, courtesy of ICIJ, and it's obviously, you can see it's in Russian, but translated, you can see the text there. There's always a way out. ELPs offer an alternative solution. At the moment, this type of partnership does not and will not fall under the laws of disclosure. So, and then you can see, this is the chart of what happens in the number of active ELPs at some of the top addresses where ELPs were present in the UK. and you can see there's a slight surge when the UK introduces its transparency laws, but actually it's more appealing to have a Scottish limited partnership. When the laws are extended to Scottish limited partnerships in 2017, then there's a huge surge in English limited partnerships. And these are offered by, we found 5 companies, we say, were really the ones that were primarily offering these English limited partnerships. Now, you can go, they've all got websites, they're all in Russian. You can go on the Internet Archive and look them up, put them through translators. They have big pictures of big double-decker red buses. They say, why don't you hey, we've got a great idea. I know it's difficult to push your money through an offshore company in the Caribbean, but come to London. And, it's pretty nakedly advertised. So just, I was explaining that we've got these huge trends going on in these English limited partnerships. But when you look at the paperwork for them, the actual information available is very, very small. So, we were harvesting as much as we could from the UK corporate registry, but we were getting things like, if you see on the top left there's a sort of little squiggle, which in our early stage of our research, we just called that the ZZ signature. It looks like 2 Zs written over each other. But then, again, thanks to the Pandora Papers, we found ZZ. ZZ is this chap, Alexandru Turner. He's a nominee, and that's his passport there. And these are the markers we look for when we're trying to work out which agency, which formation agent that the shell company falls into, but signature is an important one. And so Mr. Turner had a social media account in Russia, and there's some photos from his social media account, and that's him with his wife. That's a Moldovan marriage certificate they're holding, and that's his wife's passport, which was also in the data. And it turns out that on LinkedIn, his wife works for the company Formation Agent, and she too signs the document. So it's a sort of husband and wife team. This is Ruth Neidhart. She was a proxy signatory for one of the largest IOS, one of the largest company formation agents, particularly active in the former Soviet Union. And she's been signing paperwork since 2009 for this entity, for this agency, and she's been associated with about a dozen firms in Nevis, the British Virgin Islands, Belize, Panama, Dominica, and the Bahamas. And each of those companies that she's associated would in turn form hundreds and hundreds of UK shell companies and shell companies in other jurisdictions, but primarily the UK. So we found her on social media. Here she is advertising pottery classes. So she doesn't really fit the profile of a sophisticated business figure with thousands of companies in her control. And of course, I rang her up, and I knew she wouldn't want to speak to me. So I said, can I speak to Ruth Neidhart? I'm a journalist. I'm looking to speak to Ruth Neidhart, the ceramic artist. And she was delighted to get a call from a journalist about her ceramic art, because she's doing pottery classes. She wants to be an internationally known ceramic artist. She said, yes, it's me, I'm here. What can I tell you? I'll tell you anything. I said, well, actually, I want to speak to you about your companies. She had to go very quickly. These are some other comments we had. Alexandru Turner, I went and found him. He lives in a really rundown part of North London. I've never been involved. I don't know anything. Another guy, I've absolutely no idea what's happening. My signature's been falsified. That's something we heard a lot when we found the people. This chap at the top there, Ali Mulai, his signature. Those are tracings of his signature. 6 tracings of his signature. 5 of them come from UK Companies House. The 6th one was a very brilliant reporter at BuzzFeed went and doorstepped him, but aware that he might deny that he was the Ali Mulai who signed that paperwork. Before she approached him, she had a package delivered and got him to sign for it. So one of those is the signed for signature he puts on the packages, and the other are the signatures that appear on Companies House. Now, he still denies that the 5 are his signatures, and obviously he admits that the one that he was filmed signing is his signature, but they look pretty similar. And you know, he hasn't taken his identity theft case to the police, let's say. Now, those are the small fish, but I just want to sort of close up by saying, you know, one of the things we were very, very pleased to do is we were able to see sort of who were the puppet masters pulling the strings. And I don't mean like who are the ultimate beneficial owners. That's obviously an important question for each shell company. But what I was really focusing on are the enablers here. Now, each of these enabler groups have principal actors. You know, these stooges who are signing the paperwork, they're not real players. They're not organized. And the people who provide their addresses and have thousands of mail forwarding companies, they're not the real players in this situation either. Nor indeed are the suppliers of nominee owners that might be in the Seychelles or the Marshall Islands or something like that. They're not the real players. The real players are these guys. Now, I won't go into how we got to identify each of them, but these 5 are the core figures who sat behind our 5 agencies that they were big in every iteration of UK partnerships that have been intensely popular with clients from the former Soviet Union, and have been absolutely all over all of the big laundering scandals of recent times. So I would just say my sort of 2 key takeaways is there is no point trying to come up with a solution to this. We have to acknowledge that and I don't mean that in a pessimistic way. Honestly, I don't. If you have to understand the problem involves endless ingenuity. If you know that you're facing an opponent with endless ingenuity, then the only response is constant vigilance. And that I think is a critical message for policymakers to be aware of. And the second thing I would say is that shell companies are not this impossible problem. There are a very small number of highly specialist providers. If policymakers choose to regulate them or enforcement authorities choose to tackle them, it's not like you tackle one shell company. You can tackle a whole class of them. It can be done. And I'll just final slide to show that's back to the sort of core typologies. But this typology and those providers I mentioned, those 5 providers, they're active now in Canada, in Denmark, and Ireland. Now, and using the same structures, the same nominees, and everything. And I'm hoping that's going to segue a bit to the next speaker. Thank you.
Simon, thank you so much. And I think just to pick up on a few points, this investigation really kind of shows some of the fault lines of the UK's approach to corporate transparency. Kind of there's always a way out, that quote from the newsletter that could almost be kind of a slogan of the corporate secrecy industry, in that after the rules were tightened, as the graph shows, corporate service providers kind of were quickly able to move around the rules and create and market different types of multi-jurisdictional networks of corporate shell companies. Also, I think just to connect the 2 presentations that we just heard, I think I found it really interesting to see that just a small number of corporate service providers were responsible for the vast amount of companies through which dirty money flowed in some of the biggest scandals. So the shadiest corners of the corporate secrets industry really was focused around a few corporate service providers. Now, in contrast to that, Dan's analysis showed that actually the practice in and of itself, perhaps not the shadiest parts of it, is relatively widespread. And actually kind of corporate service providers came forward with unprompted offers of nominee services when they were approached. So those are kind of two different interesting angles here. Now, I also really like the visuals of sort of the picture of the London red double-decker buses, perhaps replacing the image of a palm tree in small tropical island nations when we talk about corporate secrecy and when we talk about sort of offshore. To tell us a bit more about that and perhaps the Toronto skyline being another visual of that. And next up is James Cohen, who is the Executive Director of Transparency International Canada since 2016, and before that worked for a variety of organizations in the international development and security space. Over to you, James.
Thank you, Sol. Thanks, everybody, for coming this morning. So we're the Canadian chapter of Transparency International Canada, and I think to Simon's point about normally when people think about secrecy jurisdictions, they don't really think about UK, although I would argue a lot of people these days think about UK, especially those in the room, but how many of you thought of snowy Canada as a secrecy jurisdiction? No, I see hands, but you already probably knew. Hidden under layers of maple syrup. We've been looking at this issue of beneficial ownership transparency since 2016 because, next slide. Oh wait, I've got a controller, yep. That's when we had our mutual evaluation report from the Financial Action Task Force, and particularly Canada fell flat on transparency around legal persons and arrangements, or beneficial ownership of companies and trusts. This is where Canada fell particularly hard in our rankings by the FATF. So we have this issue of our beneficial ownership structure system is very opaque in Canada. It's not just the FATF that looked at Canada and ranked us poorly. Transparency International itself looked at Canada in our commitment to the high-level principles for the G20 on beneficial ownership. And those principles were signed in 2014. So naturally, with the first review in 2015, not many countries have a particularly good framework the very next year, not surprising. But in 2017, when the review was done again, we're still in the back with South Korea as one of the worst countries for beneficial ownership transparency in the G20. So I just want to talk about, that's the regulatory framework we're working with in Canada, is that beneficial ownership transparency due diligence is only required up until that point by the financial institutions in Canada. They weren't at the time required, beneficial ownership due diligence wasn't required by designated non-financial businesses and professions, DNFBPs. We had no registries to speak of in Canada as well. And there was a Supreme Court ruling that said that of the DNFBPs, especially lawyers, do not have to also submit suspicious transaction reports to any regulators due to solicitor-client privileges. So there was a number of issues going against us on this front. And then to top it all off, when the FATF did their review, of course, out came the Panama Papers, and our leading newspapers or media outlets in Canada that looked into it, the Toronto Star and the Globe and Mail and the French and the CBC, our national broadcaster, and the French equivalent, Radio-Canada, review was part of the Panama Papers reviews, and of course we had to take a Canadian angle on it, and we took the famous Panama Papers look and gave the guy a parka. And said Canada Papers, and the concept name of snow washing came out of this. And we've always chalked it up to Mossack Fonseca to come up with the term, but actually it was a Toronto lawyer who came up with it. And the point was that within this, you've got this weak beneficial ownership framework within Canada. But as I said at the beginning, beyond who thinks of England, who thinks of Canada? You think of tropical places or European Alps, but not Toronto, not Vancouver, not Montreal. And this combination of who thinks of Canada and our weak beneficial ownership framework and our weak law enforcement on this issue was not lost on the intermediaries of the world. It was, in fact, quite noted. And so the whole idea about snow washing is essentially bring your dirty money to Canada and it will be cleaned like the pure white snow. And within the multi-part series that was conducted by the Toronto Star and CBC and Globe and Mail, nominees were looked at, of course, and in part 3, there was a particular dive into case studies of nominees, and they looked at two particular, one named Karen McIntyre, and this was from her deposition to a U.S. investigation in 2011, because it just so happens that some of our strongest law enforcement in Canada about money laundering is one of the strongest enforcement agencies for Canada is the Southern District of New York to conduct investigations. So this was conducted in her deposition. She'd been selling her signature since about the 1990s. She was a secretary for a Swiss lawyer, and her boss approached her saying, "How would you like to make some extra money on the side selling your signature?" She made about $20,000 a year doing this, and some of the companies that she sold out her signature to were involved in Ponzi schemes, money laundering systems, and in her deposition, she makes these comments. The question from the prosecutors in the U.S., it was just somebody paid you to use signature and nothing more. That is correct. It is literally nothing more. It is literally nothing more. That you did nothing other than sign papers. Nothing other than sign papers. So you were just a name put on documents, a Canadian director. Did you ever have any concern about the legality of the documents you were signing? No. Why was that? I was receiving them from lawyers. You felt that because you were getting something from the lawyer, that was enough to protect you personally. Yes. So I know we're going to be talking about enablers later in the week on other panels, so that's just a segue into those conversations. So there we have the setup for the system in Canada. Look at the nominees. Now, with TI Canada, we've been working with the coalition of organizations, Canadians for Tax Fairness and Publish What You Pay Canada. Our coalition is informally known as the End Snow Washing Coalition because we have snow washing, we want to end it. And we've been saying that this opaque system and Canada's reputation is not lost on the money launderers or the enablers and the companies' formation agents of the world. And we always had Mossack Fonseca as our example to go by. So finally, it's 2022 now, time is blurred over the last 2 years. In 2021, we started digging through, well, who are these other enablers overseas, these company formations agents who have been actively marketing Canada? So we went looking around the internet as well to see who's just out there promoting Canada. And we came up with the report that was published earlier this year, Snow Washing Inc., how Canada is marketed as a secrecy jurisdiction overseas. And some of the things we came back with in research just left you flabbergasted, and I'm going to go through a little bit of it with you. This was from a website that was originally in Russian. Our researcher Adam Ross, who researched and wrote the report, got it translated, and there's a couple of choice quotes coming out of this. There is a trend of open corporate registries around the world. This was written before, obviously, 2 weeks ago. It's necessary to use more complex structures. If you previously used UK partnership structures distinguished with a high level of confidentiality, given today's realities, a Canadian LP would be the best choice. Canada has a positive image, rather strict taxation system, prestigious enterprise. Registration is very simple, several times cheaper. So all that advertised about Canada. Other websites, and we labeled this chapter the Canadian Shield, which is a geological formation in Canada. But there's the shield of secrecy in Canada. So Canada is a new player in the world of offshore companies. Go Canada. Coming from behind. It has no negative offshore reputation and no association with tax avoidance or evasion, providing offshore benefits without any of their traditional offshore drawbacks. A Canadian company can be used to act on behalf of offshore companies or can be used to receive and remit money offshore companies to avoid withholding taxes. Canadian LLP, a tax-free and highly reputable offshore company. So this is coming off of a number of websites that we're looking at, and these are written in English, they're written in Russian, and they're written in Mandarin. So there's a large connection, especially in Vancouver, if anybody was following Canadian news, between Vancouver and money laundering coming out of mainland China to Macau, and this has been known as the Vancouver model of money laundering. And if we want to go for an ultimate Canadian example of things, it was hockey bags full of money being given to big whale gamblers who were coming from Macau, giving to them by underground banks in Vancouver in the parking lots of the casinos. They'd take the money in the hockey bags full of cash into the casino, get it cashed in for chips, gamble a bit, and then get a certified casino check that they could then bring to a legitimate bank. So that's just a whole other subset of the money laundering that's going on in Canada. So in summary, what's good about Canadian companies to use as a front company? Anonymity, because of that weak system that we have, weak law enforcement. You can set up and run a limited partnership from abroad. The directors don't actually need to be, or the partners don't need to be in Canada. There's no independent oversight, and it's a whitelisted country. There's a lot going for Canada to be used. The image of an offshore company has taken such a battering over the years. Poor things. Keeping a low profile is essential. Whilst the minute legal details call for specialist knowledge, the underlying idea is usually simplicity itself. It involves the use of a respectable onshore company to front transactions. So let's look at a case study. And this was looked at, this also got brought up in the Cohen Commission that eventually wound up looking at money laundering in Canada. There was months of evidence that was being put forward by a number of experts. Gary Barrows in the UK, who anyone's following his Twitter feed, is constantly going through the UK registry and pulling up examples, and he pulled up a few Canadian examples as well. I'm over my time, so I'll go quickly through these. And one of these was a company, a formations agent called TBA and Associates, and it had ready-to-go Canadian companies such as 3A Business Consultants LLP. You could buy 3A Business Consultants LLP for the price of about $2,300 Canadian, or about $3,600 for other companies. And with that, it can be used as a nominee for companies. You can open a bank account with it, and it came with a bunch of other perks ready to go. They're signed by a gentleman, Joaquim, I don't have his last name here, but he was a nominee for a number of companies and a number of other well-known secrecy jurisdictions, with companies being involved in Ponzi schemes, being involved in very illicit websites online, and he was involved in this company. And so it wound up that 3A Business Consultants LLP was also the front, was a nominee for a number of UK businesses as well that were involved in Ponzi schemes and money laundering schemes around the world. When we approached 3AB Business Consultants LP to respond to our report and say, do you have any comments about what we've dug up? It's the usual thing of, we are registered, we do conduct due diligence. It's not on us about what people do with our companies. That we just sell the company, and that's about that. We were threatened with a lawsuit, and we said, is there anything that we've done that's incorrect in the report, including identifying that some of the directors on your website have images pulled from other websites and bios pulled from other websites? And then we just got to, please don't publish any of this. And so we did. Yet to get the lawsuit. And then Canada, we've alluded to the Azerbaijan laundromat system in Danske Bank. Canada has been involved in this. So looking at the system and the global layering of companies that are used in these sophisticated schemes, Canada is just now one of those multi-jurisdictional layering programs. And we look at one of the case studies that involved an Alberta limited partnership was the front for a number of UK companies within the Azerbaijani laundromat. So this is a particular thing about Canada, is that because we're a federated country, even if we do have a national registry, which is now pledged by our federal government, we will have a corporate beneficial ownership registry by 2023. We hope that it's still going to be public despite setbacks in Europe. The federal registry is only about the 5th largest registry in Canada. The largest corporate registry is the province of Ontario, their corporate registry. And then it's Quebec, British Columbia, Alberta. So we have to have all 14 jurisdictions sign up to a beneficial ownership registry. Otherwise, the federal government just can't go it alone. So this is our latest push to show that it's actually not just Canadian LPs, but Alberta LPs have been involved, Quebec LPs have been involved. There was a story last year about a New Brunswick limited partnership involved with a fishing trolley off the coast of West Africa, fronting as a shell company, and that fishing trolley was involved in illegal fishing that's contributing to our biodiversity degradation and contributing to economic inequality off the coast of West Africa as well. So, Canadian provinces need to wake up to the reality that they're part of this global system, whether they want to acknowledge that it's or not, or just say it's the federal government that responds to the FATF. That's not our problem. Well, it is their problem. And anybody else who has subnational jurisdictions who has this federated problem as well, I'm sure you're going through the headache of getting your provinces or your states to sign up. So this is one of our key things to go through. And as well, with all of this comes adding the fact that nominees need to report who they are a nominee for as next steps within our beneficial ownership and our anti-money laundering transparency work that we're pushing forward. So we hope to see that as one of the technical issues provided in the beneficial ownership registry that the federal government is coming forward with. We expect to see the technical details sometime in the new year for the federal government, but it really is Canada's opportunity to step up and be the new leader on the global stage and show that just because there's been setbacks elsewhere doesn't mean that the global momentum towards transparency needs to die down. And I think the case studies that we've unearthed showed the necessity of having to do so. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dan, Simon, and James, for giving us such a deep and really detailed insights into the corporate secrets industry this morning. I think looking at this issue from 3 really different angles, but all of them underline that nominees and the techniques of the corporate secrecy industry really need to be a core part of the beneficial ownership transparency agenda going forward. Now we're just at the start of this conference. Today is the very first session on the very first day. But sometimes with these events, when we all kind of go and have fascinating discussions and then everyone goes home and what happens next, that can be a bit frustrating. So before we jump into the debate, I'm sure many have burning questions. We wanted to make sure that our session today doesn't just provide you with, all these new facts and new understanding of some of the nuances of beneficial ownership transparency and what the future of this important debate might look like, especially after the ruling 2 weeks ago. But we are interested in change, and that requires connecting this discussion to concrete policy actions. We have a good kind of diversity of angles and fields represented on this panel, an academic, a journalist, civil society, and then international organizations. We did prepare 5 draft, kind of call it the 0 draft, policy recommendations for you that are available on a handout and that we wanted to present to you kind of for your consideration. These are kind of some areas that we think will go a long way in helping address these issues. And we would invite you in your comments to come in, tell us what you agree with, what you don't agree with, what we got wrong, what we missed, but hopefully come out of this session with a few pointers towards some concrete actions that could help address some of the most extreme abuses of the corporate secrecy industry that we heard about this morning. So to just kind of show you, could we have the next presentation? Thanks. So first up, we wanted to formulate something specifically on registries in light of the ruling 2 weeks ago, and sort of try to address this head on, since this is really kind of, I think, going to be one of the key questions that will be discussed here at the conference this week. So what we came up with, and again, this is all kind of open to your suggestions and refinements, was that really what matters so critically is giving access to beneficial ownership information, not only to law enforcement, but also to civil society organizations and investigative journalists that have, as we've just seen brilliant examples of today, incredible expertise in illicit finance. So that's why our first recommendation focuses on this specific issue. And then kind of second to that, I think one of the outcomes of this ruling will likely be that registries hopefully should explore creatively user-friendly models of layered access models for law enforcement, but also for foreign competent authorities, financial institutions, and civil society, and the media. Now, I'm sure many in this room are aware of the content of the ruling, but a couple of weeks ago, and I think in what surprised many of us, the EU Court of Justice ruled that access to, in any case, to all members of the public of beneficial ownership information is invalid. So that ruling invalidated the provision of the 5th Anti-Money Laundering Directive, which ruled that registries of beneficial ownership information in the EU should be publicly accessible. So this is our first recommendation up for discussion. Then our second recommendation, we really wanted something that focuses on enablers, since we've basically spent the entire morning discussing the role of enablers and in the corporate secrecy industry. And we found that while public access has been subject to a lot of, a devoted campaign, in comparison, anti-money laundering regulation and supervision of corporate service providers hasn't received that much attention and is equally important in the beneficial ownership transparency agenda, as we just heard a lot about today. So this includes strengthening the regulation of these types of arrangements, nominee arrangements that we heard about. For example, through increased transparency, through licensing, or some countries have registers of nominees as well. So our second recommendation is also alluding to a recent change in the FATF standard on beneficial ownership, which included a strengthening in the roles of nominees. So this is our proposal for our second recommendation, focusing on enablers. And then next, since I think many of us, or at least many of us on this panel, agree that registries are a very important part of the solution, and the ruling from the European Union Court of Justice 2 weeks ago doesn't change that. They will continue to be a very important part of the solution going forward. We felt that it was important to formulate something on sanctions, on compliance, and on enforcement, because a registry is only as good as the information it contains, and it really critically depends not only on the architecture, but also on who you register. Registering the pottery artist that Simon spoke about in a beneficial ownership registry is not going to give you what you want in order to fight crime. So this is why our third recommendation focuses on enforcement, trying to develop mechanisms to detect nominees. That can be done, I think, technically by relatively easy searches, but also really kind of focusing on compliance and sanctions. And then, and this is, I think, perhaps the reason we're all here today, I think we wanted to do something that really addresses the threat to journalists who work on this important topic, and sort of both legal threats and physical threats. So that's why I think in order to address some of these abuses, really kind of anti-SLAPP laws and things like whistleblower protection laws are so important to help foster the media environment in which investigations like the one we heard from today are possible and are not just quenched by litigation. So this is our recommendation number 4. And then finally, and this is directly picking up on a point that James made in the example that he gave, where the person who was interviewed said, well, didn't you think there was anything shady about this? And the reply was, no, I didn't think so because I was handed these documents by a lawyer. I think the role of legal professionals in the corporate secrecy industries deserves attention, and that's why we included a recommendation that should hopefully, that focuses on attorney-client privilege protections and asks that governments and bar associations as well should clarify that the provision of company services of these type are not covered by attorney-client privilege protections. Now, lawyers are excluded from anti-money laundering obligations in some countries, and I think we have seen, aside from the examples today, there's websites that advertise attorney-client privilege packages as part of a corporate service package. So that's why we included that as another of the recommendations. So with that, I would like to open the floor. I think you can come in with suggestions about the recommendations, questions about the panel, but we kind of hope to benefit from the expertise in this room, but also kind of leave with not just interesting facts and ideas, but also an idea of what actually needs to change and what do we need to integrate in the agenda and in the campaign going forward.
There, then here.
Yes.
Hi, is this on? Is this working? Yes, it is now. Hi everyone, Louise Russell-Pravata from Open Ownership. Thanks so much for a really valuable, interesting panel, and congratulations on all the research that's gone in to make this happen. Just a couple of quick comments from Open Ownership's perspective on the recommendations, which I think are really timely, clearly given the recent ruling. On recommendation 1, I think layered access is a really important way of cutting through this. Should everything be public or nothing be public and everything be private? We've found that particularly in regions of the world, such as countries in Latin America where there's quite a lot of pushback to the idea of public access, talking about layered access can be quite reassuring. One of the things that perhaps I'd suggest looking at adding to this recommendation based on the last month's court ruling is that whether or not access for civil society and journalists is based on legitimate interest, one of the things that's come across really clearly in our work and the conversations I've been having with others in civil society is the need for civil society and journalists to be able to access data on the register in bulk as a whole data set. Like the Finance Uncovered investigation, of course, just wouldn't have been possible without that sort of access. So some way of enshrining that sort of, right to access the data in bulk, not having to submit a request to each individual record and their potentially having to prove legitimate interest to a per record basis. That, and of course, if things, particularly in the EU, look like they're going down a route in the short term of defining access based on legitimate interest, the need to define that really broadly to ensure that, for example, freelance journalists can access the register as effectively as those that are affiliated with a news outlet. And then the other just quick comment on I had was on recommendation 3, just to really 100% support the focus on both sanctions and effective enforcement. And I wondered if you might want to just sort of highlight the utility of a risk-based approach in there in order to make it really practical for authorities to target their available resources to those entities most likely to be sort of disclosing nominees. But this really exciting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louise. And of course, we always love adding a reference to the risk-based approach to our recommendations. I don't know if anyone from the panel wants to come in on the comment on recommendation 1.
I think the horse is bolted, but I just wanted to have a very quick whinge, which is layered access. You know, I'm hearing that I sense that this is a staging post. And that this is on the other side, those who are pushing for privacy / secrecy, rolling back transparency, they're going to resist, but they will concede layered access. But then they'll start attacking who gets that layered access. What is legitimate interest? Well, what legitimate interest for what inquiry? What's your probable cause for wanting to know the beneficial owner of that company? What journalist are you? What accreditation do you have? You're only a blogger. Well, that's a member of the public. All that sort of pushback. This is a staging post for them. That they will destroy any attempt to have an established definition of layered access.
Yeah, just reflecting on our own work, we are asking for critiques and comments from the audience, but reflecting on it, I would say just the idea that is the recommendation 1 at the moment particularly applies to the EU and I suppose some other countries where privacy is a much higher concern. But for those countries that are planning on going full public and want to stay that way, the UK registry will hopefully stay fully public. And we'd certainly hope that the Canadian government won't backtrack on their pledges. We still say for those who don't have a ruling or can't cite direct, mass physical harm to people registered, yes, by all means, keep going public and don't backtrack on it.
Hi there. My name's Franz Wild. I'm with the Bureau of Investigative Journalism in London. I'm sort of parallel organisation to Simon. I'm probably going to just jump on his whinge there. I think in terms of the ruling 2 weeks ago, I'm interested in how we actually tackle this because as far as I can see, the sort of use of the right to privacy is so deep. You really have to go out. You really have to come at it on that level, and I don't know how you do that because that starts. There's been a general shift towards privacy on several of these issues. I mean, it also comes. It also relates to how you identify people who are kind of suspected of corruption or wrongdoing in the public domain. And so there's a whole raft of things that are kind of quite slowly being closed down. And, we talk about, James, you just mentioned the UK. I'm very sure that there'll be a similar attack on the UK register very shortly. So I'm I certainly don't think that recommendation 1 goes far enough. Most investigations by authorities are triggered by things people see in the press. The press is often the first port of call. So, there are many, many journalists out there. And as Simon says, if you need to kind of prove that you have just cause to access this information, you're never going to get there. And you might as well just close it down. So I think something like that, you just have to attack it on a much deeper level.
Yes, hello. I'm over here. A very quick question, very quick comment. My name is Frank Vogel. I'm the chairman of the Partnership for Transparency Fund. But I happen to have written a book about a year ago called The Enablers. And I'd like to just comment on your, I think it's recommendation 3. I think you've got to get much tougher. You've got to start naming the enablers. But most important of all, we need a law in many countries that actually makes the chief executive officer of major companies that do enabling, make them also subject to the law. It is absurd that Goldman Sachs can be involved in a $4.6 billion money laundering fraud scheme with the government of Malaysia, and the chairman is in no way prosecuted. Yesterday, ABB, for the 3rd time, paid fines and settled on major Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violations, in this case with South Africa. Nothing has happened to the top executives. So we need a law of some kind in different countries, phrased in different ways, that actually makes the top executives of these companies directly liable and subject to criminal prosecution. And if that doesn't happen, all of these fines will simply be the cost of doing business, which we've seen in recent years. So, if I may humbly suggest, make it a much tougher recommendation on enablers and go for the top and not for the middle people who are constantly accused, but basically are working within corporate cultures encouraging corruption, money laundering, and associated crimes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this comment. We've heard a few comments now saying that our recommendations don't go far enough, in particular recommendation 1 and recommendation 3. And then we've heard some, I think, reassuring support for the recommendations. It's good to see, I think, that we're at least going somewhat in the right direction. I would be interested, perhaps if we can do a quick show of hand in the room, who would agree that overall these recommendations do not go far enough and need to go further, kind of yes or no? Who thinks they need to go further?
Can I make a small point? I can feel the sort of people reaching for their pitchforks here, and I just one sort of moment of caution, I would say, you know, when we were reporting out our findings this summer, you know, I had a sense, and I'm still sort of animated, exercised on this topic, but one of the things that we had to get this through a legal process to get it into print. And one of the things that the lawyer kept asking me is what they're doing illegal? Is secrecy illegal? And I'm like, no, it's not illegal, but it's facilitating this awful behavior. And he said, well, yeah, but is what they're doing illegal? And it's not, right? So the analogy that and the lawyer said, well, we can't print it then. And I said, but it's massively in the public interest. So the analogy that I always come back to is it's like the Texas gun shop that's selling semi-automatic weapons, you know. It's very analogous to gun control. So the gun shop it's not illegal for them to sell them, but they know that their products are very capable of being used for illegality. In fact, it's hard to imagine a scenario where their products could not be used for illegal behavior. You know, you don't go on a hunting trip with a semi-automatic rifle. What do I know? I'm British. But you know what I mean? That this is, I think treading this balance between understanding that these people are not doing anything currently illegal is really quite important.
And therein lies, and to that point about privacy and none of this is illegal. People use it for perfectly legitimate reasons. Why are you going after so many legitimate people when it's just a few bad actors? Can't we just let law enforcement do this? And the banks have a risk-based approach. They're doing just fine, aren't they? Obviously, no, they're not. And the privacy issue is always going to come up. And from our perspective, our coalition, we did a legal analysis based on the Canadian Constitution, based on the Privacy Act, and we found that the data fields that we want published in bulk pass muster with privacy obligations based on what we're trying to achieve. And we've constantly, now that there's political will for a public registry, the rebuttal has kind of died down, but for a long time the goalposts kept getting moved about, well, you're looking at the data points individually. What about the data points in bulk? Or, there was always something coming up. So with the privacy, it is you can make the legal arguments, but there's the legal side and then there's the feels. People put way more information out there on social media every day, but that's them putting it out there. They just don't feel like having a government agency put it out. So we found with the European ruling, it was very much based on, does this data, is it enough for anti-money laundering to be out in the public? And from my initial reading, based on that argument, the court said no. So our coalition has very much been arguing this from not just a money laundering perspective, but a business angle as well. It got to a point where we spent more time making the business case for a publicly accessible beneficial ownership registry than even saying the word money laundering. We were saying that this is good for business. At the time, we were saying eventually when we go into renegotiated trade negotiations with Europe, it's a competitive disadvantage for Europe to be working with a country that doesn't have a publicly accessible beneficial ownership registry when they do. It's a benefit to our companies to be able to do the due diligence. That's now out the window. So hopefully we can use that in trade negotiations with countries. But it allows small, medium-sized enterprises to be on the same footing as large companies who can conduct due diligence. Small companies that have to do paperwork multiple times to the insurance provider, to the bank, to other DNFBPs, they only have to do that beneficial ownership paperwork once for the registry, and then everyone can access it. So small mom and pop shops, which are the biggest concern for Industry Canada, they now have a competitive advantage. We're dominated by a small set of large banks, so this puts smaller players on an equal footing with the large banks to have access to that registry. And then for the designated non-financial businesses and professions, the real estate agents that are one-person shop, the lawyers who are one-person shop, all of them now have beneficial ownership due diligence requirements. It just makes sense to have a public registry rather than going through the reams of organizations that have to register for it. So there's a business argument to be made outside of the privacy, outside the money laundering, outside organizations like us want to pry and see things. It's a very dollars and cents argument that can be made for this. Just to Frank's point, yes, absolutely. We need laws that are much stiffer than just the price of doing business. And from our perspective, there's an MP in Canada who is pushing forward a law, and we've wanted it introduced as well about not just a fine, but actual criminal conviction for lawyers who it can be shown in court that there was knowing willful blindness of signing off on documents.
Thanks. The point that James just made about the importance of considering other policy ends of transparency registers as well, just to highlight, I think is particularly important in thinking about the consequences of this, the ruling from the EU Court of Justice. The court did not say that public access is never justified under any circumstances by policy ends. The court only considered anti-money laundering as the policy end because that is how it is justified in the EU anti-money laundering directive. So it analyzed whether, given the anti-money laundering objective, which the court confirmed is an objective of general public interest, whether the interference to Article 7 and Articles 8 of the Charter, privacy and personal data, is proportionate and justified and in line with GDPR, limited to what is strictly necessary. Now, on that question, we know that the court came down with saying no. But saying that, strictly speaking, looking at anti-money laundering, access to those with a legitimate interest is sufficient. Now, you can argue about that, and I think the consequence will be, as Simon and some of the comments already alluded to, like, what is the definition of legitimate interest? How is there going to be a central definition? How do you prove it? What are the actual mechanisms? And I think there is some kind of very practical considerations that obviously were not looked at in the judgment over access that are just as important as the legal arguments. But also, the court did not say that civil society and media shouldn't have access to this information. They just said, well, they have a legitimate interest, so we don't need general public access beyond that. I think, unfortunately, we're running close to time because all the sessions got shortened. Are there any other burning questions that we can take before we close up? Yes, please.
Прошу прощения, уважаемые коллеги, у меня плохой английский через перевод.
Excuse me, dear colleagues, my English is not so well, so like I will tell and my colleague will translate.
Меня зовут Канат Тургунбеков, я глава финансовой разведки Кыргызской Республики.
My name is Kanat Turgunbekov. I am head of FAU Agency of Kyrgyz Republic, Central Asia.
Благодарю спикеров за прекрасные отчеты и, послушав наших коллег, естественно, по приезду в Кыргызстан я первым делом постараюсь внести Канаду в список высокорисковых стран, потенциальных к отмыванию доходов.
Thank you, dear speakers, for all the lecturing and recommendation. Everything was so useful. And first of all, what I will do when I'll be back in my country, I will include Canada in the high-risk countries list.
Это было, конечно, шуткой.
Of course, it's a joke.
Да, а вопрос такой конкретный, потому что подразделения финансовой разведки на сегодняшний день прекрасно справляются со своими обязанностями, они занимаются поиском похищенных активов, находят их, но фактического, практического возврата не происходит, потому что слишком разные законодательства всех стран. Поэтому у меня предложение максимально унифицировать законодательство всех стран, чтобы осуществлять фактически возврат похищенных активов, потому что частенько переводятся, простые преступления переводятся в разряд политических, так как преступники, которые похитили государственное имущество, средства часто оказываются, представляются как политическими узниками. Вот надо разделять вот эти моменты и унифицировать национальные законодательства. Как вы насчет этого смотрите?
So my maybe question/recommendation will be, how do you think about bringing all the legislations to one unified standards? Because, for example, FAU agencies in our country, for example, we do our work, so we trace, so we can find some of the assets that were taken out of the country. But when we come to the actual steps how to get this money back, it's always problematic because those who escape the country sometimes pretend to be legal people, so like legally working, taking their money, but in fact they are just like crime offenders. And those people sometimes say that they've been perpetrated because of the political issues, and that's why they escape the country. So we always face these challenges that we know we found this, but we cannot take this money back. And this is also like complicated because of the difference. And for example, in the EU region, it might be much easier, but for us who are out of this union, so it's much more difficult. And that's why maybe you can give any advice or recommendations how to, what can be used to make this process more effective. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this contribution. I think perhaps we need to add a recommendation on asset recovery and the link to beneficial ownership to our list. Of course, exactly the challenges that you were describing with tracing assets in recovering assets are why we as the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative work on the topic of beneficial ownership at all, because that's usually the first challenge in trying to trace assets and then hopefully at some point return them to the country from which they were taken. So that link is exactly kind of why kind of our entry point into into this topic. But thank you so much, and I think we've taken on board the suggestion of perhaps something specifically on asset recovery. Now, I think we unfortunately don't have much more time. I would love to continue this discussion, but I think we have a whole week to continue some of these discussions. We will continue to, I think, take your comments on the recommendations. So please just approach anyone who is up on the panel here right now. We want to kind of take away from this session some concrete actions that we can use in communications and in campaigns going forward. And I really thank you all for coming. I hope that you took away from the session not just some of the facts and some of the concepts, but also what James called some of the feels of what does the corporate secrecy industry feel like, what do the marketing materials look like, how is this sold, like to those who actually go out and try to stay hidden. There's always a way out is not a particularly uplifting motto, if we have one for this session. But I'm confident that I think together we can come up with some good ideas of how to tackle this, but also how we can try and bring some of this information and these discussions into the larger corporate transparency agenda going forward. Thank you very much for coming.